The crystal towers of Veltharis caught the light of 3 suns and scattered it across the sky like broken glass. It was the most beautiful world in the known galaxy, and it had been chosen for a reason. Beauty, the elder species believed, encouraged peace. But on this day, peace was the last thing anyone expected. The summit hall sat at the peak of the tallest tower. Its walls were alive, grown from a mineral that hummed with low vibrations, responding to the emotions of those inside. Right now, the walls pulsed a deep, anxious red. Over 200 delegates from across the galaxy had gathered in the circular chamber, and every single one of them was afraid. The Kreth swarm was coming. They were a species of living nightmares, billions of interconnected bioships that moved as one mind, devouring entire star systems for fuel. For decades they had stayed in the outer rim, feeding on dead worlds. But now they were pushing inward, and 3 colony systems had already gone silent. At the center of the hall, raised on a platform of pale blue stone, sat Queen Salith Ranvora of the Velsharian Dominion. She was enormous by any standard, nearly 4 meters tall, her segmented body covered in plates of dark chitin that glowed with soft bioluminescence. 4 arms rested on the edges of her throne. Her compound eyes, each one the size of a human head, reflected the entire room at once. She saw everything. She missed nothing. Salith had ruled for over 300 years. She had broken rebellions, negotiated treaties that spanned galaxies, and commanded fleets that could darken the sky of any world. When she spoke, civilizations listened. And right now, she was listening to the Kreth ambassador threaten everyone in the room. The ambassador was a Kreth drone, a pale, writhing thing suspended in a column of fluid at the center of the hall. It did not have a mouth. Its words came through a translation membrane that turned its hive thoughts into sound. The sound was wet and unpleasant. The swarm requires systems Vel 9, Caruum, and Thessa Minor, the drone gurgled. You will surrender them within 1 rotation cycle. If you do not, the swarm will take them, and then it will take more. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over each other. The Rillian ambassador, a feathered creature with 6 wings, demanded a military response. The Gorvan representative, a being made almost entirely of compressed stone, argued for negotiation. The thinkers of Paul, disembodied minds floating in magnetic jars, calculated odds, and declared them unfavorable no matter what course was chosen. Nobody agreed. Nobody acted. Fear had turned the most powerful beings in the galaxy into noise. Salith watched it all with cold patience. Her antennae, long, delicate structures that could taste chemical signatures in the air, picked up the sharp scent of panic from nearly every delegation. It disgusted her. She had hoped the elder species would find their courage today. They had not. Her gaze swept the room and stopped on a figure she had almost forgotten was there. In the far corner of the hall, seated in the smallest chair at the lowest table, was the human. Commander Adan Mercer sat with his hands folded in front of him. He was not tall. He was not impressive. He wore a simple dark uniform with a single row of service marks on his chest. His hair was cut short, and there were lines on his face that came from too many years of not sleeping enough. Among the glowing, towering, armored beings that filled the hall, he looked like a mistake, like someone had accidentally let a child wander into a room full of giants. Humanity had been traveling between stars for less than 200 years. By galactic standards, they were infants. They had been given a seat at the summit only because the Galactic Charter required it. Nobody expected them to speak. Nobody expected them to matter. Mercer had been sitting quietly for 3 hours, watching the chaos unfold. He had listened to every argument, every threat, every calculation, and he had grown very tired of all of it. He raised his hand. The chamber did not notice. He raised it again and cleared his throat. A Gorvan delegate glanced down at him and made a rumbling sound that the translator rendered as amusement. "The human wishes to speak," it announced, the way someone might announce that a pet had done something clever. Laughter rippled through the hall. Even the Kreth drone seemed to quiver with something like mockery. The session moderator, a tall, silver-skinned being with no face, turned toward Mercer. The human delegation has not been recognized for formal address. You may submit written remarks after the session. I would rather not wait, Mercer said. His voice was calm and carried no anger, but it carried no apology either. You are not recognized, the moderator repeated. Mercer stood up anyway. He was the smallest person in the room by a wide margin, but something about the way he moved made a few delegates stop talking. It was not confidence exactly. It was something quieter, something that did not care about the size of the room or the power of the beings inside it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small data chip, a flat, unremarkable piece of human technology. He walked to the central display console, and nobody stopped him, perhaps because nobody believed he could do anything important. He placed the chip on the console. 3 months ago, he said, his voice filling the sudden silence, the Kreth swarm sent a vanguard fleet to a mining colony in the Harkins drift system, 400 bioships. The colony had 12,000 civilians from 6 different species. They sent distress signals to everyone in this room. He paused and looked around the hall. Nobody answered. The silence became heavier. Nobody except us. He tapped the chip. The air above the console shimmered, and a holographic projection began to take shape, a tactical recording, dense with data, showing the dark void of space and the terrible cloud of Kreth bioships descending on a tiny, flickering colony. And one human ship, hanging in the black like a single spark against the night. Mercer looked at the Kreth ambassador. Then he looked at Queen Salith. Then he looked at the rest of them, every elder species, every ancient civilization, every powerful being that had sat in this room and done nothing while people died. I did not come here to ask for your permission, he said. I came to show you what we already did. He activated the recording. And the room went very, very quiet. The hologram filled the summit hall from floor to ceiling. Stars appeared first, cold, distant points of light scattered across the black canvas of the Harkins drift system. Then came the asteroid belt, a slowly tumbling river of rock and dust that circled the system's pale sun. And then, emerging from the dark like a swarm of living disease, came the Kreth. 412 bioships. The recording tagged each one with a small red marker. They moved together like a single organism, pulsing, shifting, tightening their formation as they closed in on the colony below. The colony was a small thing, a cluster of pressurized domes on an airless moon, home to 12,000 miners and their families. 6 species, children among them. The distress signal played through the hall speakers. It was a woman's voice, trembling but clear. She was speaking in trade common, the shared language of the galaxy. This is Harkins Station to any receiving vessel. We are under attack. Kreth bioships, hundreds of them. We have no military escort. Please, anyone, please respond. The recording showed the signal bouncing outward through space. It reached a Velsharian patrol fleet. They noted it and forwarded it to Command. Command classified it as a low-priority border incident. It reached the Rillian trade corridor. They rerouted their ships away from the area. It reached the Gorvon Mining Authority. They logged the signal and filed it under future review. Nobody came. Then a single blue dot appeared at the edge of the hologram. It was moving fast, faster than it should have been, its engines burning at a rate that no safe operating manual would ever allow. The UES Adamantine, Human Rapid Response Carrier, 46 crew. The hall was silent. Every delegate stared at the tiny blue marker heading straight toward the red cloud. We received the signal 19 hours after it was sent, Mercer said quietly. He stood beside the hologram, his face lit by the blue glow of his own ship. We were the closest vessel. We were also the only vessel that changed course. The hologram showed the adamantine dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. The Kreth immediately detected it. Dozens of bioships broke formation and turned toward the new arrival. 46 people, the Rillian ambassador whispered, against 400 ships. Mercer did not respond. He let the recording speak for itself. The adamantine did not charge forward. It did not run. It slid sideways into the asteroid belt and disappeared among the tumbling rocks. The Kreth followed, and that was their first mistake. The humans had studied the Kreth. They knew that the swarm operated through a shared psychic link, every ship connected to every other ship, coordinated by a central intelligence. This made them fast. It made them efficient. But it also meant there was a tiny delay, less than a second, when the hive mind had to process unexpected information and send new orders. In open space, this delay meant nothing. In a dense asteroid field where the environment changed every heartbeat, it meant everything. The adamantine used the rocks like weapons. It would appear from behind an asteroid, fire a concentrated burst at a bioship's vulnerable underbelly, and vanish before the swarm could react. When the Kreth adapted and began surrounding asteroid clusters, the humans changed tactics. They planted explosive charges on drifting rocks and detonated them as bioships passed. When the Kreth adapted again and spread their formation wider, the adamantine punched through the gaps and struck at isolated ships. Every few minutes, the humans did something different. They never repeated a tactic. They never gave the hive mind enough data to build a reliable prediction. The Kreth were fighting an enemy that refused to behave like anything they had encountered before. The delegates watched in stunned silence as the kill count climbed. 10 bioships destroyed, then 30, then 70. The small blue dot danced through the red cloud like a flame through dry grass, and the red markers began to blink out one by one. But it was not free. The hologram showed the damage the adamantine was taking. Hull breaches on 3 decks, atmosphere venting from the port side, fire in the engine compartment. The ship's medical bay was gone, hit by a direct strike in the 4th hour. At the 6-hour mark, the recording showed something that made Queen Salith's antennae go perfectly still. A section of the lower deck was burning. The fire suppression systems had failed, and the heat was spreading toward the ammunition storage. 2 crew members were trapped behind a collapsed bulkhead. The tactical officer reported that the section should be sealed and vented to space standard procedure. Acceptable losses. It was the logical choice. Mercer refused. He handed command to his second officer, climbed into a damaged maintenance suit, and went into the burning section himself. The recording showed him cutting through the collapsed metal with a handheld torch, dragging one crew member over his shoulder and pulling the other by the arm, walking through a corridor where the walls were glowing orange with heat. His suit's temperature alarm was screaming. He did not stop. He got them out. He sealed the section himself. Then he went back to the bridge and resumed command with a broken arm and burns across his back that would leave scars he would carry for the rest of his life. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, 247 Kreth bioships were destroyed or crippled. The colony was saved. 19 human crew members were dead. The hologram faded. The hall remained silent. Salith's antennae trembled. Her species could taste emotions through chemical traces in the air, and what she tasted now, coming from the lingering data of the recording, was something she had never encountered in 3 centuries of rule. It was not courage. Courage was common. It was not rage. Rage was simple. It was something deeper and stranger, a cold, burning refusal to accept the way things were. A defiance that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with showing up. The Kreth ambassador broke the silence. Its translation membrane produced a wet, dismissive sound. 1 engagement, 1 ship, this proves nothing. The swarm has millions of vessels. Your species is irrelevant. Mercer turned to face the drone. His expression did not change. He did not raise his voice. That was not a battle, he said. That was a Tuesday, We were not prepared. We were not equipped. We were not supposed to win. He took a step forward. You want to see what happens when 8 billion humans actually prepare for a fight. He looked around the room one final time. Because I promise you, every single species in this room should be grateful that we have only ever pointed our stubbornness at things that needed to be stopped, not at things that needed to be conquered. He picked up his data chip, put it back in his coat, and sat down. The summit hall remained silent for a very long time. The walls had stopped pooling red. They had turned a color that nobody in the room had ever seen them produce before. Later, the Velsharian scientists who studied the crystal would confirm that the color had no name in any known language. The closest translation they could offer was a single word. The Kreth ambassador withdrew from the summit before the day ended. It said nothing more. Its fluid column simply went dark, and the drone inside it folded into itself and stopped transmitting. The message was clear, diplomacy was over, and the swarm would answer with teeth. The remaining delegates scattered like startled birds. Some rushed to contact their governments. Others began calculating escape routes, already deciding which systems they would sacrifice and which they would defend. Fear had returned to the room, thicker than before, because now the threat was not a possibility. It was a certainty. But Queen Salith did not leave. She remained on her throne long after the hall emptied, her compound eyes staring at the place where the hologram had been. Her 4 hands rested on her knees, perfectly still. Her advisors stood at a respectful distance, waiting. They had served her for decades and knew her moods. This was not anger. This was not worry. This was the stillness that came before she made decisions that changed the shape of history. "Bring me the human," she said. Her chief advisor, a slender Velsharian named Draven, bowed low. "Your Majesty, the human delegation holds no strategic value. Their fleet is insignificant compared to—" "I did not ask for your opinion, Draven. Bring me the human." The summons reached Mercer in his quarters, a small, plain room at the bottom level of the diplomatic tower, as far from the important delegates as architecture would allow. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, rolling his injured shoulder and staring at the wall. His data chip sat on the table beside him. He had watched the Harkins drift recording 400 times, and he still could not watch the part where his crew died without his hands shaking. A Velsharian guard arrived and informed him that the Queen requested his presence. Not invited, requested. In the Velsharian language, there was no polite way to say it. When the Queen spoke, the universe was expected to rearrange itself accordingly. Mercer put on his coat and followed. The Queen's private chambers were aboard her flagship, the Throne of Living Stars, which hung in orbit above Veltharis like a second moon. It was less a ship and more a floating ecosystem, 3 kilometers long, covered in organic structures that grew and breathed and responded to the Queen's moods. Mercer was escorted through corridors of warm, humid air that smelled like rain on alien soil. The walls glowed with soft green light, and tiny creatures, symbiotic organisms that lived within the ship, watched him with curious, glittering eyes as he passed. The royal chamber was a biodome at the heart of the vessel. Trees that were older than human civilization grew from a floor of dark, rich earth. Water ran in thin streams between their roots. The ceiling was transparent, showing the stars above and the curve of Veltharis below. Salith stood at the center of the dome. Without her throne, without the formality of the summit hall, she was even more imposing. Her bioluminescence was brighter here. Patterns of light rippled across her chitin in slow waves, like thoughts made visible. She turned her massive head toward Mercer as he entered, and her compound eyes caught him in 1,000 tiny reflections. "You may approach," she said. Her voice was deep and layered, as if several instruments were playing the same note at once. Mercer walked forward. He did not bow. This was not rudeness. Humans simply did not bow to foreign monarchs, and Salith had studied enough about them to know this. She found it neither offensive nor admirable. It was simply what they were. "Commander Mercer," she began, "I have a question. I figured you might. At Harkin's Drift, you had 46 crew. Your ship was outgunned by a factor that our mathematicians describe as impossible to overcome. You had no support, no reinforcements, no reasonable chance of survival." She paused, her antennae tilted toward him, reading the chemical traces that his body produced, the invisible language of stress and memory and old pain. "Why did you go?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. He looked at the trees, at the water, at the stars above. Then he looked back at her. "Because someone was screaming for help," he said, "and we were close enough to hear it." Salith studied him. She had expected a strategic answer, a calculation about territorial importance, or a political justification about protecting Allied assets, or even a patriotic declaration about human pride. She had not expected something so painfully simple. "That is not a rational reason," she said. "No," Mercer agreed, "it is not. Your species would spend lives, your own lives, on an act that has no guaranteed return. Every time." Salith turned away from him. She walked to a console built into one of the ancient trees, a seamless blend of technology and biology, and activated the Dominion's most advanced strategic intelligence system. It was called the Deep Root, and it had been modeling threats and predicting outcomes for longer than most species had existed. She fed it everything, every piece of data on human military history, every recorded engagement, every tactical decision, every war they had ever fought among themselves and against others. She asked it a single question: what is the accurate threat level of the human species? The Deep Root processed for 11 seconds. This was unusual. It normally answered in less than one. Then it returned its assessment. Salith read it, and her bioluminescence flickered in a pattern her advisors had never seen before. Later, Draven would describe it as the light equivalent of a gasp. The assessment read, "Unable to model accurately. Human decision-making does not optimize for survival, resource preservation, or territorial gain. Primary optimization target appears to be abstract value-based reasoning, concepts translated approximately as meaning, duty, and refusal to accept. These variables cannot be reliably predicted or quantified. Recommendation: do not engage as an enemy. Probability of unconventional response APPROACHES certainty. Outcome of such RESPONSES cannot be forecast." Salith closed the console. She stood in silence for a long time, the light on her body shifting through colors that had no names. Then she turned back to Mercer. "Commander," she said, "I am going to offer you something that no human has ever been offered. I am going to offer it because my intelligence systems tell me you cannot be predicted, and because I have lived long enough to know that what cannot be predicted can either destroy you or save you. I choose to be saved." She stepped closer. Even with her standing at full height and Mercer barely reaching her lowest set of shoulders, there was no sense that she was looking down at him. She was looking at him directly, as an equal, and the weight of 300 years of galactic authority was behind her gaze. "I am offering you joint command of the Velsharian war fleet, full authority, equal standing with my own war admirals. You will help me plan and execute the campaign against the Kreth swarm." Behind them, Draven made a sound like cracking stone. Several other advisors shifted in visible distress. One of them began to speak, but Salith raised a hand without turning around, and the silence was immediate and total. Mercer looked at her. He did not blink. He did not hesitate. "When do we start?" Salith's antennae rose. Something passed across her face, not surprise, because she had expected him to accept. Something closer to confirmation. She had made a bet on the nature of this small, fragile, impossibly stubborn creature, and he had just proven her right. Her advisors erupted the moment Mercer left the chamber. Draven was the loudest. "This is madness." He is from a species that has been in space for less than 2 centuries. He has no understanding of galactic-scale warfare. He is a force I cannot calculate, Salith said, and her voice silenced the room the way a stone silences a pond. I have ruled for 300 years by knowing which forces can be measured and which cannot. Every species in this galaxy fights according to patterns I can predict. The Kreth, the Rillians, the Gorvan, they are equations, and I have solved them all. But that man and his people are not an equation. They are something else entirely. She looked at Draven with all of her 1,000-faceted eyes. And I would rather have that something else standing beside me than against me. She left the chamber without another word. Behind her, the symbiotic trees swayed gently in air that tasted, for the first time in centuries, like something the Velsharian had almost forgotten. It tasted like hope. Word traveled fast. When the galaxy learned that Queen Salith had given a human equal command over the most powerful war fleet in known space, the reaction was immediate and loud. Some species called it desperation. Others called it insanity. A few, mostly the younger civilizations who had spent their short histories being ignored by the elder races, called it the first interesting thing to happen in 1,000 years. Within weeks, the coalition began to form. The Rillians joined first, sending a fast-attack wing of their razor-thin interceptors. The Gorvan followed with heavy siege platforms, enormous ships built from compressed asteroid cores that could absorb punishment that would vaporize any other vessel. Even the thinkers of Paul contributed, offering their unmatched computational abilities to coordinate fleet movements across multiple star systems at once. But it was not politics that built the coalition. It was the recording. Somehow, the hologram from the summit, Mercer's recording of the Battle of Harkin's Drift, had leaked. Within days, it had spread to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Billions of beings watched a single human ship fight through impossible odds, and something shifted in the collective consciousness of 100 civilizations. If those small, soft, short-lived creatures could do that, then maybe the Kreth were not as unstoppable as everyone believed. Mercer did not have time to think about any of this. He was too busy trying not to get killed by his own allies. War Admiral Kithais of the Velsharian was the finest military mind in the Dominion. He was tall even by his species standards, his chitin so dark it seemed to absorb light, his movements precise and economical. He had commanded fleets for 160 years and had never lost a campaign. He fought the way a mathematician solved equations, with elegance, precision, and absolute certainty. He hated Mercer from the first day. "You are chaos given a uniform," Kithais told him during their first joint planning session. The war room aboard the Throne of Living Stars was filled with holographic star maps and tactical projections, and Kithais had spent 6 hours building a perfect formation for their first engagement against a Kreth patrol fleet in the Tesserin corridor. It was beautiful, every ship positioned with geometric precision, every firing angle calculated, every retreat path optimized. Mercer studied it for 10 minutes and then said, "This will not work." Kithais's bioluminescence turned a shade of cold violet. "Explain." "It is too perfect. The Kreth hive mind is built to counter perfect formations. It identifies patterns and adapts. The more structured your approach, the faster they learn to break it." Mercer tapped the holographic map, scattering Kithais's careful arrangements. "We need to be messy. We need to give them noise instead of signal." "That is not strategy. That is the absence of strategy." "Sometimes the absence of strategy is the best strategy." Their first engagement in the Tesserin corridor was a disaster, not because they lost, but because they nearly destroyed each other's plans in the process. Kithais executed his precise formations on the left flank, while Mercer led the human contingent in unpredictable strikes on the right. The two approaches clashed, creating gaps that the Kreth nearly exploited. They won, but barely, and the after-action review was the closest thing to a physical fight that two commanding officers could have without actually throwing punches. But something happened during the second engagement that changed Kithai's forever. A Velsharian medical frigate, the Gentle Current, carrying 300 wounded soldiers and a crew of 80 healers, took a direct hit from a Kreth bioship and began drifting toward the enemy line. Its shields were down. Its engines were dead. It was, by every tactical calculation, lost. Kithais ordered the fleet to maintain formation. The frigate was gone. Mourning it was acceptable. Breaking formation to save it was not. Mercer broke formation. He pulled his entire flanking wing away from the battle and drove it straight toward the Gentle Current. Kithais screamed at him over the communication channel. He called it reckless. He called it suicidal. He called it the act of a species too young to understand the cost of war. Mercer did not respond. He was busy. His ships formed a wall between the drifting frigate and the incoming Kreth. They took hit after hit, their shields flickering and failing, their hulls cracking under the pressure. 2 human destroyers were lost in the first 4 minutes, but they held the line long enough for the Adamantine, rebuilt, scarred and carrying a crew that had volunteered to sail in her knowing full well what she attracted, to lock onto the Gentle Current with a towing beam and drag her out of the fire. The frigate was saved, the wounded survived, the 80 healers lived. And something unexpected happened. The rest of the Allied fleet, which had been fighting with the grim efficiency of soldiers doing their duty, suddenly fought like something else entirely. The Rillian interceptors, who had been running careful hit-and-fade attacks, threw themselves at the Kreth with a ferocity that startled even their own commanders. The Gorvon siege platforms, which typically maintained conservative firing patterns to preserve ammunition, opened up with everything they had. Even the Velsharian line ships, disciplined to the point of rigidity, began pushing forward with an aggression that Kithais had never seen from his own people. The Kreth patrol fleet was destroyed in its entirety. Not one bioship escaped. Kithais stood on the bridge of his command ship afterward, staring at the tactical readouts, trying to understand what had happened. The numbers made no sense. The Allied fleet had been losing before Mercer's suicidal rescue. After it, they had fought with nearly double their previous effectiveness. There was no rational explanation. But there was an irrational one. Mercer had shown every soldier in the fleet that someone would come for them, that if they fell, they would not be abandoned, that their lives were not acceptable losses on a spreadsheet, and soldiers who believed that, soldiers who knew, in their bones, that they mattered fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Kithais did not apologize. That was not the Velsharian way. But he began listening to Mercer in planning sessions, and when Mercer suggested something that seemed insane, Kithais learned to wait before dismissing it. The campaign pushed forward through 3 star systems. It was ugly and costly and nothing like the clean, elegant wars that the elder species were accustomed to. But it worked. The Kreth were pushed back, system by system, and for the first time in living memory, the swarm was retreating. Then came Dihal Makur. The Kreth's forward hive nexus sat at the heart of a dead star system, wrapped in layers of living chitin and bioelectric shielding so dense that long-range scans could not penetrate it. It was the coordination node for the entire Western swarm, the brain that controlled millions of bioships across dozens of systems. If it fell, the swarm would fragment. If it held, the war would drag on for decades. The Allied strategic AI gave them a 22% chance of success. Mercer gathered the human contingent, now swelled with volunteers from every colony Earth had ever planted, young men and women who had watched the Harkins drift recording and decided that they wanted to be part of whatever came next. He stood in front of them in the cargo bay of the Adamantine and looked at their faces. He saw fear. He saw determination. He saw the same stubborn light that Salith had tasted in the air of the summit hall. He did not give a grand speech. He said 5 words. They think we will stop. He let the silence hold for a moment. Let's not. The Battle of Dihal Makur was the worst engagement of the war. The The Kreth threw everything they had at the Coalition, waves of bioships so dense they blocked the stars, living torpedoes that screamed through space and detonated against shields in bursts of acid and fire. The Allied line buckled. The Gorvon platforms cracked. The Rillian interceptors were swarmed and overwhelmed. At the critical moment, when the Hive Nexus was pouring its full psychic fury into coordinating the defense, and the Coalition was moments from breaking, Mercer did something that Kithais would later describe as either the bravest or the most insane act in the history of warfare. He took the adamantine straight into the maw of the Hive Nexus. The ship dove through the bioelectric shielding, through the layers of living chitin, through corridors of organic matter that tried to crush it. The swarm's psychic network screamed, and every bioship in the system turned toward the adamantine, drawn like antibodies to an infection. The pressure on the Allied fleet vanished in an instant. Mercer broadcast on all channels, his voice steady despite the ship breaking apart around him. "Coalition fleet, the door is open. Walk through it." They walked through it. They poured through the gap like water through a cracked dam, and the Hive Nexus shattered under the combined fire of every ship in the fleet. The adamantine came out the other side trailing fire and leaking atmosphere from a dozen wounds. Half its systems were dead. A third of its crew was injured. Mercer was pulled from the bridge with shrapnel in his shoulder and blood in his eyes. But the ship was alive, and so was he, and the Hive Nexus was burning. On the bridge of the Throne of Living Stars, Queen Salith watched the adamantine limp out of the wreckage. She did not speak. Her bioluminescence went through a pattern that her advisors had never recorded before, deep gold, brighter and brighter, until she glowed like a small sun in the darkness of the bridge. She gave a single command: record this moment, every archive, every world, every library and every system we control. Let no one forget what one species was willing to burn for. Beside her, Kithais stood with his 4 hands clasped behind his back. His dark chitin reflected the gold of the Queen's light. He watched the battered human ship crawling through the debris, still broadcasting, still fighting, still refusing to stop. "I was wrong about him," he said quietly. "I was wrong about all of them." Salith said nothing, but the gold light on her body burned brighter, and the walls of the ship hummed with a frequency that the Velsharian used for only one thing: a hymn of gratitude. 1 year passed. The galaxy healed slowly, the way all things heal after great violence, unevenly, imperfectly, with scars that would never fully fade. But it healed. Without the Hive Nexus at Dihal Makur, the Western Kreth swarm had shattered into 1,000 mindless fragments. Some drifted into deep space and went silent. Others turned on each other, their bioships fighting without coordination, without purpose. The remaining Kreth leadership, the Eastern Hive Queens who had watched the war from a safe distance, sent envoys to the Coalition with a single message: enough. They would withdraw beyond the outer rim. They would not return. It was not a perfect peace. The Kreth were still out there, and nobody believed they would stay quiet forever. But for the first time in a generation, the shipping lanes were open, the colony worlds were rebuilding, and parents in 100 star systems could put their children to bed without wondering if they would wake up to sirens. The coalition that Mercer and Salith had built did not dissolve after the war. Instead, it grew. It was given a formal name, the Pact of Living Fire, chosen by the Rillian delegation in honor of the burning adamantine that had broken through the Hive Nexus. The name stuck. It carried weight. When species spoke of the pact, they did not think of committees and treaties. They thought of a single ship wrapped in flames, still flying, still broadcasting, still refusing to give up. Mercer hated the name. He hated that his ship had become a symbol. The adamantine was just a ship. His crew had been just people who got scared, who made mistakes, who missed their families and complained about the food and played cards in the mess hall during long jumps. Turning them into legends felt like stealing something real and replacing it with something shiny but hollow. But he kept that opinion to himself. The galaxy needed its symbols, and he was not going to take this one away from them. He spent the year after the war doing things that never made it into the histories. He sat with the families of the 19 crew members he had lost at Harkin's Drift and told each family, personally, how their loved one had lived and fought and mattered. He visited the rebuilt colony on Harkin's moon and walked through the domes where 12,000 people now lived in safety. And he did not tell anyone who he was, and nobody recognized the quiet man in the worn jacket who stood for a long time in front of the memorial fountain. He attended the funerals, all of them, not just the human ones. When a Rillian pilot who had fought at Dihal Makur died from injuries that had taken months to claim her, Mercer flew 14 hours to attend the sky burial on her homeworld. When a Gorvan siege engineer who had held his platform together with raw willpower and emergency welding finally succumbed to structural fatigue, Mercer stood among the stone beings at the ceremony and said nothing, because the Gorvan grieved in silence and he respected that. The scars on his back never fully healed. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder ached when the air pressure changed. He slept poorly and dreamed of fire and the sound of hull metal screaming as it tore apart. He never spoke about any of this, because there were thousands of soldiers across the coalition who carried the same wounds and the same dreams, and his were not more important than theirs. When the Galactic Accord reconvened for the first time since the war, it was held on Veltharis again in the same crystal tower. But the hall felt different now. The walls, which had pulsed with fear and anxiety a year ago, glowed with a steady, warm light. The seats were fuller. Species that had never attended before, younger civilizations, smaller nations, peoples who had always been told they were too insignificant to matter, now sat among the elder races as members of the pact. Queen Salith entered the hall last. She moved slowly, not from age or weariness, but from the deliberate gravity of someone who understood the weight of what she was about to do. Her bioluminescence was muted, a soft, steady white that the Velsharian reserved for their most sacred moments. Her advisors followed behind her in a line, and among them, walking without any particular self-importance, was Kithais. She took her place at the center of the hall. Every eye, every sensor, every compound lens in the room turned toward her. The silence was complete. "I have ruled for 312 years," she began. Her voice filled the chamber without effort, carried by the crystal walls to every corner. "In that time, I have seen empires rise and fall. I have watched stars die. I have made decisions that shaped the lives of trillions, and I have lived with the consequences of every one of them." She paused. Her antennae swept the room slowly, tasting the air, reading the emotional landscape of 100 species gathered in one place. "1 year ago, I sat in this very hall and watched the galaxy fail. I watched the most powerful civilizations in known space, my own among them, freeze in the face of a threat we all knew was coming. We had the ships, we had the weapons, we had the numbers. What we did not have was the will to act." Her gaze moved to the upper balcony, where a single human sat in a simple dark uniform, watching from the same kind of unremarkable seat he had been given the first time. Mercer met her eyes and did not look away. And then a man stood up in this hall, a man from a species we had dismissed, a species we had measured and found small. He was not the tallest, he was not the strongest. He did not have the longest life or the greatest technology. He had 46 people and 1 ship, and he flew into the dark because someone needed him. She let the words settle. "We measured humanity by their fragility, and we found them wanting. We measured them by their lifespan, and we found them brief. We measured them by their strength, and we found them unremarkable." Her voice dropped lower, and every being in the hall leaned forward. "But we never measured them by the one thing that mattered. We never measured their refusal to accept the unacceptable. We never measured the fire that burns in them when they see suffering and decide, not calculate, not debate, but decide that they will not allow it to continue. They do not fight because they are strong. They fight because something inside them will not let them look away. And that, my fellow sovereigns, is not a weakness. Her bioluminescence flared, a pulse of brilliant white that lit the entire chamber. It is the most terrifying and beautiful force in this universe. She raised one of her 4 hands and gestured toward the human delegation section. I stand before this accord today to formally elevate the human species to founding member status within the Pact of Living Fire. They will hold equal standing with the eldest among us. They will have a voice in every decision. They will never again sit at the lowest table or be told that they do not matter. She looked around the room. Her compound eyes reflected every delegate, every face, every expression. Does anyone object? Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The crystal walls of the summit hall glowed with a steady, golden warmth, and the silence was not the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of agreement so complete that words would have only weakened it. After the session, as delegates filed out and the hall slowly emptied, a young Velsharian cadet found Mercer on the upper balcony. She was barely out of her molting stage, her chitin still soft and pale, her eyes wide with the kind of reverence that made Mercer deeply uncomfortable. "Commander Mercer," she said, her translator struggling with her nervous speech patterns. "Why are you sitting up here? You should be down there with the founders, with the Queen." Mercer looked at her and gave a small, tired smile, the kind that carried more weight than it showed. "I am not a founder," he said. "I am not a dignitary. I am just a guy who showed up." The cadet stared at him as if he had said something in a language she did not speak. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then bowed a deep, formal Velsharian bow that she had probably only ever given to her own queen, and walked away without another word. Night came to Veltharis. The 3 suns set in sequence amber, then violet, then deep red, and the crystal towers caught the fading light and held it like memories. The summit hall was empty now, but one corridor on the upper level still glowed with soft light. It was the memorial wall. The names were etched in starlight, a technology the Velsharian had developed specifically for this purpose. Each name floated in a small constellation of its own, turning slowly, never fading. There were thousands of them now from every species that had fought in the war. Human names sat beside Rillian names, Gorvan names, Velsharian names. In death, there were no junior species and no elder races. There was only the shared cost of survival. Mercer stood in front of the wall. He had found the 19. He always found them first. He read each name the way a person reads the words of a prayer they have memorized but will never stop saying. He did not hear Salith approach. For a being of her size, she moved with remarkable silence when she chose to. She appeared beside him like a shadow given form, her bioluminescence dimmed to the faintest glow, a mark of deep respect among her people. She said nothing. She simply stood there, towering above him, looking at the same names. They remained that way for a long time. The stars turned slowly above the transparent ceiling, and the light from the memorial wall painted their faces in soft, shifting constellations. Then Salith did something that no Velsharian had ever done for an outsider in the recorded history of her species. She reached out with one of her 4 hands, the upper left, the one closest to where her people believed the soul resided, and placed it gently on Mercer's shoulder. It was a gesture so intimate, so sacred in her culture, that her own guards, watching from the far end of the corridor, looked away out of respect. It was the touch reserved for bondmates and blood sworn, and those who had earned a place so deep in a Velsharian's heart that no word in any language could describe it. Mercer did not flinch. He did not speak. He placed his own hand, small, scarred, human, over hers, and they stood together in the quiet light of the names of the dead. No words were exchanged. None were needed. She had ruled 12 galaxies. She had commanded trillions. She had broken empires and outlived stars. But in that moment, standing beside a scarred, stubborn, impossibly small creature from a pale blue world at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy, Queen Salith Ranvora understood with every fiber of her ancient being that she had finally met something worthy of her reverence. Not a god, not a weapon, not a conqueror. Just a man who refused to stop. And she never doubted him again.